So let's start right away with our first speaker. We figured we would just go by alphabetical order. So Philip Ball is a freelance science writer and author of many popular books on science. His most recent books include The Beauty of Chemistry, Art, Wonder, and Science, The Elements, A Visual History of Their Discovery, and The Book of Minds, How to Understand Ourselves and Other Beings from Animals to AI to Aliens. He has also written on the uses of color, pattern formation in nature, quantum physics, beauty in science, and how life works. So many very grand questions. Besides writing books, Philip also regularly contributes to Nature, where he worked for over 20 years, and various other publications, including New Scientist, Prospect Magazine, and Chemistry World. He's also the presenter of Science Stories on BBC Radio 4, and has broadcasted at many other occasions on radio and TV. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry and received a PhD in physics from the University of Bristol. Philip, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me. It's a pleasure to be here. And you've introduced some of the books I want to talk about, because when I started to think about what I would say to this panel, I was actually surprised to find out just how much history of chemistry I had written about. And in some ways, that's no surprise, because it's clearly one of my favorite topics. But I was surprised at how much I'd been able to get away with. And I do think getting away with it is the right way to see it. I don't intend to imply there was any subterfuge in that. Carl Djerassi, who towards the end of his career began writing plays and novels, was quite explicit about what he saw as a mission to, I think he actually used the word, to smuggle chemistry and its history into those works. So it was something of a conscious mission of his to communicate science in the guise of something else. And probably most famously, Carl joined forces with Roald Hoffmann to write this play Oxygen, about the disputed discovery of that element in the 1770s and 1780s by Scheele and Priestley and Lavoisier. I'd like to think that instead, I include the history of chemistry in my books, not because I want to sort of foist it unawares on readers, but because the stories I want to tell can't be told without it. So they're generally not stories about chemistry at all. It's rather that chemistry, like all of science, has always been integrated into the history of ideas, culture, and of society. And this is probably the most dramatic example of that. So this is a book that Sarah mentioned called Bright Earth. It was triggered many years ago by a talk I heard Robin Clark of UCL give. And Robin collaborated sometimes with the British Museum on analysing pigments. And the issue that his talk raised for me seems embarrassingly obvious now. Embarrassing, that is, because like many people, I'd never thought about it before, even though it is obvious. In short, Robin's talk set me thinking about what exactly it is that artists' materials throughout time are made from. And, you know, the truth is, of course, that the production of pigments and dyes has been a driver of chemical innovation since antiquity. And this realization led me to this book in 2001 called Bright Earth, and it tracked that co-evolution of chemistry and color through time, and how ultimately that gave birth to the chemicals industry in the 19th century. But for me, the real story here was about how those chemical innovations transformed art and its use of color. So it wasn't a book about the history of chemistry, but about the history of art. And I hope that it would do for some readers what it did for me, which was to open a door on art that had sort of previously been a closed door to me. So, you know, the art, particularly of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, came to life for me through this window. So when I looked at these works, I wasn't any longer trying to struggle with the classical or the biblical references or the, you know, what seemed like now antiquated conventions in which they were rendered. I could think instead about the workshops and the apothecaries where these colours were made and ground. I could think about the networks of trade through which the artists obtained them, and about the systems of patronage that paid for them. And so the story I wanted to tell was about colour and art, and how creativity interacts with the materials that are available. And I don't think that that would have worked in the same way if I had seen this simply as a vehicle for smuggling in some history of chemistry. And then what drove me to write this biography of the Swiss alchemist and physician Paracelsus, called The Devil's Doctor, was both a fascination with that mercurial man himself and with the world in which he lived, in which natural magic and alchemy weren't pre-scientific superstitions and follies, but were the fertile soil within which modern science could start to take root. Paracelsus transformed chemical medicine. In a sense, he had reinvented alchemy as a kind of nascent biochemistry. But the real impetus for this book was to challenge popular ideas about the rise and fall of magic. And my 2004 book, Critical Mass, began by digging deep into the molecular sciences, into the molecular physics of Maxwell and Boltzmann, both as a facet of the emergence of statistical thinking more generally in the 19th century and the origin of our understanding of phase transitions and collective phenomena that is now being applied to areas like the social sciences. Then in these books on pattern formation that I wrote, and there are several of them, The Self-Made Tapestry was the earliest, and there's plenty of chemical history. I talked about, for example, Liesegang bands in the late 19th century, the Belousov-Jabotinsky reaction, the beginnings of the understanding of reaction diffusion systems. But the emphasis here was on, really, it was on the interdisciplinarity of this question of natural pattern formation. And, this is such an inherently visual subject. This is the kind of illustrated version of the Self-Made Tapestry that I produced later with a publisher called Quarto that specializes in these kinds of books. And then this book on this is the American title. In the UK, it was called H2O, Biography of Water. And this was full of molecular physics and biochemistry, both historical and contemporary, but all in the service of explaining and exploring the strangeness of this most familiar of compounds, water. So in all of these cases, my goal was never to relate some chemical history, but to provide the context to understand the evolution of ideas, whether it's about pattern and form or about political philosophy. And that's really the point I wanted to make here. I think there is, there's a significant general audience for some topics in science, for quantum physics, for evolutionary theory, for cosmology. These are the popular ones. Sad though it may seem, I don't think at this point that there is much of a wide readership for the history of chemistry per se, but that isn't an obstacle to writing about it for a general audience when it is part of another tale. I've almost never sat down and thought, I'm going to write a book about the history of chemistry, but only in the same way as I've never done that for the history of physics or biology or science generally. What motivates me in these books is the history of ideas like invisibility or unnaturalness or curiosity in this book, which have to go wherever the subject demands, whether that's, and not to think about disciplinary boundaries, either in the sciences or beyond. It's not that people have no appetite for the history of chemistry. It's just that there's no need to serve it up as such. The history of chemistry is, of course, really the history of our material culture and of our understanding of what the world is made from. Now, I said almost never. I almost never sit down and write a book about the history of chemistry. Occasionally I have done. Here's one example. This was commissioned by the Royal Society of Chemistry, and frankly, it is for a more specialized audience. It actually has pictures of molecules in it, for example. And my goal here was to present history, I hope seriously, but also accessibly. And the same is true for the book that Sarah mentioned, the history of this is a visual history of the discovery of the elements. And it was also commissioned, in fact, by Quarto. And, it's really striving to take advantage of the sheer beauty of the subject matter, because chemistry is, and always has been, one of the most visual of sciences. So I figure, why not take advantage of that? So I suppose, looking at this stack that I now have down here, I'd say that there are plenty of ways of writing about the history of chemistry for a general audience, and plenty of appetite for it. You just have to find the right vehicle for it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was really, really interesting, and a lot more to talk about in the discussion. But before we do, let's move on to next speaker. So Annette Lykknes is a historian of chemistry and professor of chemistry education at NTNU, Norwegian University of Science and Technology, in the Department of Teacher Education, where she is also the leader of the research group Science Humanities. Annette holds a PhD in chemistry education, history of chemistry, and has published on the history of women chemists and collaborative couples in the sciences, on the history of chemistry education and how chemical engineers in the early 20th century shaped their identities between academy and industry, on writing cultures in science classrooms in Norway, on experimental practices in Ethiopian schools, and teacher education. In 2012 and 2019, respectively, she co-edited the volumes For Better or For Worse, Collaborative Couples in the Sciences, and Women in Their Elements, Selected Women's Contribution to the Periodic System. Annette has also collaborated extensively with natural scientists, science educators, pedagogy scholars, historians, philosophers, and sociologists of science. Annette, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks to the Commission for inviting me. I'm excited to discuss with you the use of history of chemistry in chemistry teaching and how audiences such as teachers and students might influence what kind of stories from the history of chemistry we should tell. I am a historian of chemistry with background in chemistry, and I also do chemistry education research. And since I work in teacher education, I'm interested in how history of chemistry can be used to provide good teaching in chemistry, especially within meta topics such as the nature of science. And also how we as historians can contribute to chemistry teaching by providing scholarly informed yet accessible histories that teachers can use and students embrace. However, I do experience a gap that I feel is not well understood by either community. Actually, we can talk about three communities which intersect here: historians of chemistry, chemistry educators, and chemists. All have different perceptions of how research should be done and different standards for quality. In fact, these fields represent three different research traditions: the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. All have an opinion on what history of chemistry is and what kind of history they need or want. So let me give you an example. In one of our early history of chemistry conferences many years ago, one participant who was a chemist interested in history of chemistry approached me, telling me how disappointed he was that the presentations contained very little chemistry. He was interested, for example, in what a historical chemist did, while historians who gave the presentations wanted to present new research, novel approaches to history, and not descriptive stories with chemical details. I've taken part in similar discussions when preparing anniversary histories. And likewise, chemistry educators also have their purposes. The curriculum is packed, there's little time to dig into historical cases. But some anecdotes from the history of chemistry seem to some to be a fun way of showing how chemists worked in the past and a way to humanize science. The problem might be that the stories that are told become so simplified that very little of scholarly historical work is left in those stories. So how do we cope with these different needs and at the same time show respect for proper history? And how do we combine such deliberation with pragmatic considerations like limited time in schools, and keep it in mind that most teachers are not trained in history of chemistry? Such worries are not new. In 1974, historian of science Stephen G. Brush published an article in Science titled "Should the History of Science be Rated X?", where he stated that a teacher who wants to indoctrinate his students in the traditional role of scientist as neutral fact finder should not use historical materials of the kind now being prepared by historians of science, as they will not serve their purposes. An historian and philosopher of science and science educator Douglas Ulkin followed up with an article 30 years later with a similar title, "Should the Sociology of Science be Rated X?" And while the new history of science that Brush discussed took heroes of science down from their pedestals, Ulkin stressed that the idealized, romanticized science is a lie. threatening the impersonal scientific method often described in textbooks. And following up on this, Olkin called for a new type of history teaching in science education, one that does not verge on myths. And typical ingredients in the mythical narratives that are often found when history of science is used are, as Olkin described it, anecdotally, stories that heroize historical actors, idealize scientific processes, create linear timelines instead of showing the web of history, and sharpening actors' roles for the sake of telling a good story. But let us also discuss the other side. Are we as historians ready to give teachers what they need to practice good history teaching? As someone who has been part of all the three mentioned communities, I have sometimes felt that historians write only for each other. There's very little in many scholarly articles that I believe will interest and be accessible to chemists and chemistry educators the way the work is presented in many historical journals today. Reflections are going deep theoretically at a level that is difficult to grasp for someone trained in the natural sciences, and particularly with a teaching aim in mind. So the question is, how can scholarly historical work be translated to the right audiences? Are we willing to write more descriptive yet reflective and enlightening articles? For example, I am topic editor for History of Chemistry of ChemTexts, a textbook journal of chemistry, and I often approach historians who are experts in fields I think would interest chemists and chemistry educators. But many are not interested nor have the opportunity to take the time to write for a different audience. So most of the manuscripts I receive come from chemists interested in chemistry, interested in history, not from historians. And writing such articles is a very good opportunity to disseminate scholarly knowledge and reach out. Teachers often do look for easily accessible materials, and many are interested in using history of science, but they often only find the anecdotes. And then let me give one example of how we as historians can engage in disseminating our work broadly. As I'm sure you are aware, UN and UNESCO select international years to celebrate science. 2019 was declared as the International Year of the Periodic Table. And the European Chemical Society and the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry work together to initiate activities and encourage their member chemical societies to do the same in their own countries. At my own university in Trondheim, a group of scholars with different competences worked to travel to schools with the periodic system. We prepared an exhibition at the Natural Science Library, we gave talks to the public, and we wrote articles in magazines read by chemists and teachers. And internationally, as Sarah mentioned, Brigitte van Tiglen and I edited a collective volume on women and their contributions to the periodic system, with scholarly informed articles that were short and therefore accessible to a broader public. And we know that the book has been used in teacher education to teach about the nature of science in at least a couple of countries. So the idea was to use our expertise to provide the public and chemistry teachers in particular with up-to-date scholarly materials to make it easier for them to provide the type of history of science that Olkin was talking about. Of course, we must not be naive to think that everything will change because of a few initiatives from our side. And we know from historical research that it often takes very long for new knowledge to enter school textbooks and classroom practices. But we need to start reflecting about the reason for the lack of scholarly informed history of science in school, not blame it on the teachers, but think of ways where we can disseminate our work more broadly. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Annette. Yeah, again, so much to talk about. I really look forward to the discussion. So our next speaker is Jesse Smith, the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Science History Institute, where he oversees collecting activities and interpretive projects in the public history of science and technology. He was the curator of Downstream, a temporary exhibition on the history of water analysis and protection, which received 2022 Institutional Achievement Awards from PA Museums. a 2022 Award of Excellence from the American Association of State and Local History, and the 2022 Dibner Award for Excellence in Museum Exhibits from the Society for the History of Technology. Jesse is also the associate editor of the journal History and Technology, and his writing has appeared in a variety of publications, including the Washington Post and the exhibition A Catalog Pool, a Social History of Segregation. Jesse received his PhD in the History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Jesse, thank you so much for joining us, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Yes, and thank you for having me. And Sarah, you and your colleagues have assembled a nicely diverse panel for a conversation on audiences. So I'm really excited to think about these different modes for bringing the history of chemistry to various audiences. And my contribution will hopefully build on the really thoughtful comments that have been shared so far. And I'll give you a quick overview of the exhibition Downstream that Sarah mentioned, because I think it's a nice demonstration of how the curatorial affairs team at the Institute thinks about the history of science, the history of chemistry for broad audiences, especially those that may not have pre-existing knowledge of chemistry or of the history of science. And it really reflects our effort to show how our knowledge of the material world shapes our political, social, and material world. We have a permanent exhibition that we might call more of a disciplinary history of chemistry and chemical engineering. But in our temporary exhibitions, we attempt to tell stories in a bit of a different way. So let me share my screen here. Okay, Sarah, can you see that? Okay. Start this. Okay, so this is Downstream, a temporary exhibition that opened in September 2021 and will be open through this summer. And Downstream explores more than 200 years of water analysis and water protection, grounding that history in specific places. Apologies, I'm having a little bit of trouble advancing these slides. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. So it proceeds according to two registers. One is chronological. We begin here in Philadelphia in the late 1700s, when the neighborhood around the Science History Institute was recognizing that its sources of water were increasingly polluted by growing residential population, by businesses, soap makers, brewers, tanners, as well as significant traffic through the port of Philadelphia. You can probably see here that we start each of the historical episodes in this exhibition with the articulation of a problem. And as we move through time, we pair objects and assets from our collection. So here we have a microscope and a book from our library, The Microscopy of Drinking Water, along with external assets. This is an image of a local waterway in the 19th century that was increasingly polluted by factories, by industrialization. So we're really pairing the history of knowledge and the techniques and instruments by which we generated knowledge of human and environmental health with broader historical context, and also making deliberate attempts to pair these scientific, what appear to be scientific assets with representations of place. So really grounding this in an environmental history as well. So as the exhibition moves through time, it also moves through increasing scales of environmental interventions. So here you're looking at the second historical episode in Downstream, and this is looking at the emergence of statewide environmental interventions in the United States in the 19th century. So in 1895, Pennsylvania becomes one of the first United States to pass a statewide environmental law. And these interventions are driven in large part by new knowledge of the world. And here we're pairing this content with pH meters that were generating knowledge in Pennsylvania of the effects of coal mining on local waterways. We then move into mid-20th century environmental management according to natural boundaries. So in this case, river basins. In 1961, the Delaware River, which is our main waterway here in Philadelphia, becomes managed by the 4 states of that basin and the federal government. It's the first state-federal collaboration to manage in water resources in the United States. And this content here is paired with instruments that are used to determine the turbidity of water. That pairing is carried forward here. There's a colorimeter and a dissolved oxygen meter that are paired with a 1964 model of the Delaware River Basin. So we're really trying to communicate that notion of scale and growing scale in environmental management, along with the kinds of instruments and the kinds of sciences that are generating the knowledge behind that political action. So really trying to tease out that relationship between knowledge and action without using disciplinary language. The exhibition moves to the federal level here in the United States in the late 1960s and 1970s. Especially interventions like the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, the passage of the Clean Water Act, and especially the significant funding that was made available through the U.S. federal government to local states and municipalities to build wastewater treatment plants. Again, just demonstrating here that pairing of analytical instrumentation along with broader stories. And we carry that forward to the conclusion of the exhibition, which looks at the global challenge of microplastics in water. So bringing that story through to the present by exploring how organizations at each of the scales previously explored, the municipal, the state, the federal, and so on, are still grappling with emerging challenges to water quality. And I just end with this less evocative image, but this is the object list that we started with for this exhibition, where we gathered everything that we had in our collections related to water. And we could have used these very same objects, the very same assets that appear in Downstream to tell a more disciplinary history of water analysis or of environmental science. But the story that I just shared with you reflects our attempts to bring people into the history of science, to bring people into the history of chemistry, using these broader stories and hopefully more familiar assets. And this is work that we're going to carry forward in future exhibitions. This September, we're opening a new show on the history of textile dyes. Next fall, we will be opening an exhibition on the history of the U.S. school lunch. And then the following year, for the 250th anniversary of United States independence, we will be opening an exhibition on the history of fireworks. So multiple attempts to borrow Philip's word, to smuggle that history of science and that history of chemistry into hopefully more familiar and seductive topics, at least for a general public. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so we have about 25 minutes for discussion. And I see there's already a question from Guillermo. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all the speakers. Very interesting, the comments, and I see, just trying to pack everything into a single conclusion, or my take-home message is that I see four audiences. I mean, the historians of chemistry, the chemical educators, chemists, and also the general audience. And then the question I have, or the kind of reflection I have, is that because Annette also mentioned this is at the margin of mainly of the two first speakers, and is that it was mentioned that the way of writing the history of chemistry is mainly done by historians of chemistry, and is the audience, the main audience is historians of chemistry. Then the question is, why do we have that phenomenon? I mean, why historians are writing only for historians and they are not trying to do, for example, what Philip Ball is doing, trying to address the general audience, or what Annette is also doing, trying to go for the chemical educator, or some others going to try to address the needs of the chemists. Why is the underlying reason of this? Is something like every community is trying to secure its place? I mean, it's because of the social underlying system? Is because historians of chemistry need to do that in order to get a job and to keep in that community? Or is the underlying reason of that kind of feudalism in the way of doing the history of chemistry? That's something I would like to ask to the three of the speakers.
I can start. Yeah, I think sorry, there's something with my yeah, I think what you try to answer it yourself. Is it because they need to do that to get a job, or because this is what counts in the system? I think that's of course part of it, but I think also sometimes historians of chemistry are just not conscious about it. They think that what they write is available. All historians write things for the more general audience to a larger extent than chemists, for example, do with chemical work. But so I think it's not bad will. It's a lack of attention to these problems and thinking about how to do it, and that it's needed, that what we do is not necessarily what that audience needs. And then, of course, when people are challenged, it's about time. Do they have the time and opportunity to do it? That's another question.
And I'll say that I feel that my work actually benefits from the conversations that historians are having with one another. I think that it leads to more challenging and sophisticated historiography that then it's my task to not translate that work. I don't think of public facing work as simply translation or the avoidance of jargon or dense conceptual language, but rather thinking about how can I take that really sophisticated historiography and put it together in a way that will seduce visitors into a history that they might not have been expecting. Downstream, as I presented it, for example, does not reflect a single work or a single historiographical argument, but rather is informed by so many different conversations among historians. I think the public facing work is made much richer by that dialogue among historians.
I wonder too whether there's an element here of the same kind of bias that we see amongst scientists of popularization in any sense being frowned upon, being, not part of the job. It actually detracts from the real job. There is that sense still. There's certainly that sense amongst scientists, and I suspect there is amongst historians. And quite recently, I had this very conversation with Peter Harrison and Rainey Daston, who were wanting to think about how to build bridges, in their case, particularly between historians of science and scientists. And, Annette talked about there being a conflict sometimes of what they're trying to do that sometimes, becomes animosity because they have different objectives. And I suspect that part of the the way to address this question is to think about those objectives. I mean, Annette, I was very interested in how you talked about. I mean, the way I perceive it, and you were probably too polite to say it this way, that there is that what the scientists want, if we're talking about writing for scientists, what they want is these great man stories, is these anecdotes, these famous tales that are told again and again. You know, there's this famous bit at the start of Richard Feynman's the Feynman lectures where he says, you know, this is how quantum mechanics came about. And then he says to his students, you know, this isn't the real history. This is the one that that physicists tell each other again and again. I don't know the real history. I can't be bothered to find out about it. So, but the problem there was that, of course, he was telling the particular history he was telling, not just because he was too lazy to find out the real thing, but because it served a rhetorical purpose. And I think this is the obstacle sometimes, that these anecdotes, these stories that are wrong or misleading or simplified, that scientists at least tell again and again, and that find their way very often into, you know, popularizations of science, aren't there simply out of laziness. They're because they serve a rhetorical purpose, and that's really what's got to be grappled with. Why are they serving scientists? What message are they giving? And are we happy with that? What, you know, where are the problems with that use or misuse of history?
Yes, and this is why we need to take the opportunity when it comes like these international years when some innovation in science is celebrated worldwide, and this is what we did for the periodic system, for example, being very conscious that it should not be the story about one man's contribution, but many other aspects. So I think it's important because if we who are trained in history or are doing historical research, if we don't do it, if we don't want to change or to address other aspects and disseminate that it's not as simple as the popular stories say, who else will do it? So it's our obligation, so to speak. And I also wanted to add to Jess's comment that you in museums and you who are preparing exhibitions, you are doing this kind of translation that I was talking about from the historical conversations into a format and a message that will that a general audience can understand. But maybe we lack more of those things in writing in other kinds of materials too.
Yes, and I'll just briefly say that I suspect that in developing museum exhibitions, we have a bit more flexibility in the sense that we're able to and tasked with the designing experiences that are meant to engage multiple audiences. So the visitor who will proceed through the exhibition, reading everything, as well as the wanderer or the person who's going to be attracted to an object and wants to learn more about the way an instrument works. So I think we get to be a bit more nimble as well.
Okay, I don't see any other raised hands, so I will use my chair's privilege and ask one of my questions. Oh, there, Arjen, is that?
Yes, that's right. I'm Arjan. Everybody can hear me?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, looks like
Yeah, in fact, I'm trained as a chemist, as a physical organic chemist. I'm also a chemistry teacher for about 20 years at secondary school. And I recently defended my PhD thesis on the history of chemistry. And that's why I've got a question for Annette. I think a wonderful possibility would be in the Journal of Chemical Education, a journal which is read by many chemistry educators. How about a special issue about the relevance of history of chemistry for chemistry educators? What do you think about it? And perhaps we can team up. And for those who are interested in my book, this is about green chemistry. It's very topical, and these issues entered the Dutch curriculum for students. at secondary school. So I really do think that it's possible to integrate the history of chemistry with the general audience through secondary schools.
Thank you. Great idea. Can you repeat what you said? A special issue on the use of history of chemistry, or?
Yes. I've never seen, and I might be wrong, but I've never seen a special issue in the Journal of Chemical Education about the role and the relevance of the history of chemistry for chemistry educators. So and I'm wondering if you see possibilities to be the editor, for instance, of a special issue for the history of chemistry in the Journal of Chemical Education.
I think it's a very good idea. I think these are the kind of initiatives that we need to take to reach out to different audiences. There was a focus section of ISIS, I think. I know that it's in ISIS, but a couple of years ago or something on history of chemistry and education. But it was very much from the historian's point of view. So this could be something completely different. I think it's a great idea, and it's something I really like to talk about because I feel it's needed. So yeah, I will think about it. Thank you.
Could I just say to that too? I would really love to see the case made for why teaching the history is so important for education generally. I think my common perception is that it's seen as a bit of color. It's a sort of an add-on that you can tell some nice stories to the students, and it helps to make it accessible. Whereas in fact, and I agree with this, Annette, it seems to me that sometimes, at least, knowing the history is actually essential for being able to contextualize what is being taught. I am writing something now about Mendel, for example. And, there is this popular history about Mendel and Darwin, and the truth, it bears little relation to that popular history. And understanding the actual story of what happened there gives some insight into why we have the narratives about genetics and about the modern synthesis that we now have. And the fact that Mendelian genetics, is still taught in science because it's the easy way in, and you can tell the story of Mendel and his peas and so on, but it gives a very misleading idea about how genes actually work and what genetics is. So I think it's really, I'd love to see that point made more clearly and more strongly, that actually learning the history can have a crucial impact on our ability to understand and contextualize the science that we teach today.
And just one comment to add to that, I think I really appreciate that, Philip. And for me, the history of science at its best, at its strongest, is really an orientation to the world. It's a way of seeing the world. And one of my goals for our museum visitors is that they leave not only thinking, I never knew that about the world, but I never thought to look at the world that way. And that seems to me a powerful orientation that can be brought to bear on so many other aspects of life and of the world.
And there has been a lot of contributions in science education about why history of science is needed and useful, and how we can use those cases to, for example, especially talk about how science, how knowledge is established, how scientists work, what we call the nature of science, to understand what happens, why, what is the practice of science. So, but often, so there has been a lot of literature on that, but not necessarily so many cases are available based on historical work, and then the next step is to translate them into something that can be directly used in the classroom.
And I think that that's a narrative that is still actively actually resisted by some scientists. that, you know, the literature tends to be, you know, still in the specialized places. And I think a lot of scientists still have the attitude that it doesn't matter how the knowledge came about, it's stuff that's true, right? So we teach it, which, you know, this audience knows is not the case.
And then it complicates things if we talk about that it wasn't as easy, it wasn't as linear as we think, and it's just not that person, but it's a lot of people involved, and then it just complicates things, and sometimes tell the opposite story of what you want, opposite message that you want to bring forward, because it's not about always being objective or rational and all these things. So it's not easy to use those stories in the classroom.
Guillermo, did you want to add or bring up a new question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that yeah, I totally agree that the important and perhaps it's very important nowadays to show the social, the economic, all the background in which the scientific ideas or the advance of science is taking place. That's the role of the history of science. And I think it's very important to show that not nowadays where all these political factors, tensions between countries are playing a role in what is happening also in science. It's a great opportunity for history of science to show those things. And as Annette said, and I'm also taking some words of Philip here, this is not happening in a linear fashion. This is something like a network of different dimensions, taking interactions among them. And another thing I wanted to say is that that idea of making a special issue on the Journal of Chemical Education, I think is something nice. And something nice is also happening at the level of chemistry journals, not only in those oriented to chemistry in education or education in chemistry. And is that different journals, for example, Angewandte Chemie, different journals of the American Chemical Society are now incorporating essays on the history of particular topics. And but this is very interesting. They often, because those are chemistry journals, they often invite chemists to write that. Then it would be really nice. This is a very good opportunity of cooperation between historians and chemists. But the general public of chemistry is also opening more in specialized journals, in the Journal of Physical Chemistry or things like that, very specialized journals. They are opening the window to tell stories about what is happening in those disciplines. I think that's also an opportunity to try to go to other audiences.
Would any of you like to reply to that, or you just agree? Okay, we have another question. Philip?
Hi, I'm a chemistry faculty member that's not a historian of science. I teach organic chemistry, and I'm very sensitive to this comment that people make, that are sensitive and sympathetic to the comment that people make, that we tell a sort of simplified version of the history of discovery of science. As someone that does research as well, that this linear path of hypothesis, chin stroking, eureka, we're done, with a few maybe control experiments on the way to test the dumber of our ideas. My question for the historians and the educators is, are there any resources that you'd be willing to share with people that teach science that bridge the gap between us teaching this sort of fallacious linear perspective, and as I'm sorry, I've forgotten our historian's name here. I'm sorry. As the and as one of our panelists says, in the limited time in the classroom that you have, not being able to dig into the nuances of a genuinely historiographical perspective. Like, are there sort of, you know, nuance 101 for university level science instructors that and resources that people would recommend, any of the panelists or other people would recommend?
That's something we need more of. There's not enough of that, but there are a few things that exist and a few initiatives that we are working on. I mentioned the things that I have been working on myself. For example, the edited volume with Brigitte van Tiggelen on women and periodic system. That consists of very short articles, scholarly informed, that I know have been used in at least science education, and I'm sure there are stories there that can be of interest to in the chemistry class too. We are also soon publishing another collective volume which Sarah contributes to, about the nature of scientific discovery on elements. So it's these are a bit longer articles, but still these kind of stories we want to tell to people who are interested in the history of chemistry, and that nuances the story that they know from before. And there are lots of simplified stories about element discoveries, and there we also have some didactic materials at the end. So there are some things going on, and there are also a few. Douglas Alking, who I mentioned, also has a list of selected episodes that he recommends to give some examples that can be used. So there are some materials out there, but we should definitely do more. And like Gimero suggested, for chemistry journals too, it's a really good idea.
Yeah, I think that I would echo a special edition of JChem Ed or something about contributions from people in the history of science and the sociology of science and the popularization of science and all these other disciplines that intersect with science, to bring a real analytical lens on what we do, and to be blunt, digest it for busy people who can't launch themselves into that discipline, into the nuances of that discipline. I think it would be a sort of wonderful bridging tool for us. So.
I think, Philip, that's a really important gap that you're identifying there. And, it also makes me want to be very clear that I'm not thinking all scientists want to keep telling these simplified stories, because clearly many don't. But I can see the challenge is to exactly find that sort of material. And this is what Peter and Rainey were talking about in this conversation. I mentioned the lack of that, and the fact that so often historians of science are speaking to each other and, aren't necessarily, they think, and I think probably, making enough effort to find ways of bridging that gap, of communicating, exactly to people like you who don't have the time and, don't have the, don't necessarily know
the training.
So I think it would be fantastic if more thought were put into that sort of resource. Yeah.
So I was wondering, we talked a little bit about how chemistry teachers use history to teach certain things about the nature of science. And Jesse, you mentioned kind of that the goal that you have for when people go through the exhibition, and like what you would like them to kind of question the way they look at the world. And I was thinking about this and wondering if the three of you, do you yourselves also have a kind of message or something about the nature of science that you generally try to communicate to the different audiences, and what is something that you kind of more generally see yourself in your work wanting to get people to give people as a takeaway? Is there something like that, or is it just telling interesting stories?
For me, that's a very good question, and quite a tough one to think about. Is there a sort of an overarching message? I suppose if there is, for me, it's to try to find ways of integrating science into the rest of our culture, to see it as part of culture. to, and that was why a vehicle like Color for Bright Earth was such a great way of doing that, because it was already there, right? It was there was in the sense of the painters who had to, in some cases, synthesize their own colors, or at least understand how to make them and how to prepare them and so on. There weren't those boundaries that we perceive today, and that exist today actually for painters who complain to me that they don't understand their materials anymore, and that's a problem. So that's really, I guess, the overarching message, that actually my perception is that amongst the general public, the boundaries that we have in academia don't exist. They don't think, if we're thinking about invisibility, for example, they don't think in terms of optics or whatever. It's a concept in itself that has a history, and that history includes ghosts and the supernatural and legends and the myth that Plato told, as well as work on metamaterials. And all of those, in a sense, are exploring this idea, and it's the idea that's at the center. So I suspect that actually the disciplinary boundaries that we tend to sort of fall into thinking don't really exist for people outside of academia, and that's good, and we can exploit that, and that's really what I want to try to do.
I'll answer that with an example that adds to the goals that I articulated earlier. In the United States during the pandemic, in particular communities, it was very popular to put signs in the yard or in a window that said "Science is real." And this was an effort to encourage vaccination. And that is a position that aligns with my own politics and my own beliefs. But I was really struck by this notion of science is real. And I think that my goal would be for audiences to question such large claims that science is any one thing, that it is this monolithic enterprise that can be captured by a statement like that. Obviously, that's tricky work, right? Because I am aligned with the individuals making the claim that science is real, but I would just like to orient our visitors in a way that would make them reflect on those kinds of claims and the work that's being done when science is described as this singular thing.
Right. Science is also constructed, right? As well as being real. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I teach a course in history of science for teacher students. It's an optional course, so those who come to the course, they are interested in the topic. And I always ask at the end of the term, what is the take-home message? What is the main thing you have learned? And every year, many say that that things are more complicated than I thought. And that's also what I wanted to convey, that so they take that with them when they are teachers. They think about the episodes that we studied, and so they can challenge or nuance the short stories they find in the textbooks, and they also know where to look for some more literature to make these stories richer. And related to this also, that there are many people involved, also people who were not in high ranked positions. So to also show the diversity of the scientific community and the value of the work that this has been done in laboratories and in conversations that led to the science we know today.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we already went a little bit over time, but thank you so much to our speakers for these really fascinating contributions and thoughts. And thank you to everyone for coming and for contributing to the discussion. Please continue to discuss if you want to online, offline. It was really, really great to see all of you. And our next meeting will be in exactly 2 weeks, so on June 15th at the same time. So please also join us for that if you want to, and have a great rest of your day.